The courtroom was half empty that morning, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Most of the faces in the gallery were board regulars, local reporters, retired court watchers, and a few curious passers-by. No one expected fireworks over a case involving a quiet, 72-year-old man named Howard Lacey. Howard sat silently beside his court-appointed attorney, shoulders slumped under a worn tweed jacket. His right cheek still bore the faint purple-yellow outline of a healing bruise. Weeks earlier, he'd been stopped outside a gas station for what the officer claimed was suspicious behavior. Witnesses said Howard had simply reached for his wallet. The officer, Patrolman Brett Lawson, said he feared for his safety and struck first. Howard didn't resist. Didn't even raise his voice. Just stared at the ground as his glasses slid off his face into a puddle. The footage, blurry but damning, had since leaked online, causing a quiet ripple of unrest through the small town. Now, in courtroom 4B, Lawson sat at the prosecution's table in full uniform, jaw set. His union rep sat behind him. The courtroom clock ticked. The judge glanced around and adjusted his robe. Is the defense ready to proceed with opening statements? Before the attorney could respond, the side door opened. A tall man in a sharp dark suit stepped in, sunglasses still on, scanning the room. He walked with a quiet confidence, measured, military. The murmurs began immediately. The judge squinted. "Excuse me, sir, this is a closed proceeding unless you're here on invitation." The man took off his glasses. "Special Agent Daniel Lacey. FBI. I'm here on behalf of my father." Heads turned. The room froze. Even Officer Lawson stiffened in his seat. A hush fell over the courtroom like a blanket. The judge leaned forward. "Did you say FBI, Agent Lacey?" Daniel gave a single nod and approached the bench with a leather folder in hand. "Yes, Your Honor. I have federal clearance and documents relevant to this case, which I believe should be reviewed in chambers immediately." Howard's attorney, a young public defender named Felton Rhodes, blinked in disbelief. I wasn't informed the defendant's son was an agent, let alone directly involved." Daniel turned to him and offered a firm handshake. "I've been monitoring the situation closely, Counselor. My father didn't want to escalate things. He told me to stay out of it." Felton stared at Howard. The old man hadn't mentioned a son, much less one working for the federal government. The judge hesitated, then gestured toward the bailiff. "Escort Agent Lacey and both attorneys to my chambers. We'll take a recess. 10 minutes. As they filed out, murmurs erupted among the remaining attendees. Officer Lawson's face had turned a muted red. He looked over at the union rep, who suddenly seemed far less confident than when they'd first walked in. The dynamic of the room had shifted, completely. In the hallway, Daniel stopped beside his father, who hadn't said a word since the young agent entered. "Dad," he said quietly, kneeling beside the seated man, "I'm sorry it came to this. But I'm not letting this one slide." Howard gave a slow nod, eyes misting over. "You always told me justice doesn't wear a uniform," Daniel added. "Today, I intend to prove that." Inside the judge's chambers, the air grew heavier as the door clicked shut behind them. Judge Harmon, a man known for being calm but cautious, adjusted his glasses and took a seat behind his desk. "Agent Lacey, you have 5 minutes to explain what this is about, and it better be worth interrupting court procedure." Daniel opened the folder with precision. "Your Honor, I've compiled federal-level background intelligence and incident patterns that may significantly alter this case's direction." He laid out several documents, internal affairs records, dash-cam footage, witness interviews, and an unsealed complaint from a previous civil suit. Judge Harmon flipped through the files, brow furrowing. "Where did you get these?" "They're publicly accessible through federal case linkages. But most state attorneys never request cross-jurisdictional data. This officer, Patrolman Lawson, has been named in 3 excessive force reports in the last 7 years. Each one settled quietly. Felton leaned over the table. None of this came up in discovery. Daniel nodded. Because none of it was filed through the state system. Every case was either dismissed under pressure or paid out through private city insurance. But the pattern is clear. The judge glanced up. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Daniel hesitated, then answered calmly. Because my father asked me not to. He believed the justice system would handle it. But I've seen too many cases like this swept under the rug. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because this isn't just about him anymore, it's about whether the system works the way we claim it does. The judge sat back in silence. After a long pause, he finally said, I'm calling an emergency evidentiary review. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. Officer Lawson's record will be examined in full. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from sleepy routine to charged anticipation. Reporters were texting furiously. Spectators leaned forward in their seats. Everyone could sense something had changed, they just didn't know what yet. When the judge returned to the bench, he brought a different energy with him. Focused. Intent. This court has reviewed supplemental material submitted by Special Agent Daniel Lacey, Judge Harmon announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Based on their relevance and legal admissibility, I am formally admitting them into the record. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Patrolman Lawson's jaw clenched. His union rep immediately stood. Your Honor, we object, this is highly irregular, overruled, the judge snapped, not even looking up. The court has every right to review materials that demonstrate a potential pattern of misconduct, particularly when the defendant's physical injuries match prior behavior noted in these reports. Felton looked stunned but pleased. He leaned toward Howard. We've got a real shot now. This changes everything. Howard didn't say a word. He simply stared ahead, hands folded, as if trying to steady himself against the swell of emotion rising in his chest. Then Daniel stood up. I'd like to request permission to testify, he said. The judge narrowed his eyes. You're not listed as a witness. I understand. But I have first-hand knowledge of events and prior interactions between Officer Lawson and my father, including one that occurred 6 years ago that was never formally reported. The judge raised an eyebrow. Go on. Daniel's voice dropped a level. It's time everyone knows what really happened, and why this wasn't the first time Officer Lawson put hands on my father. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Officer Lawson finally turned to look at Daniel, expression shifting, for the first time, from arrogance to something closer to dread. The judge tapped his pen against the bench, thinking. Very well. Agent Lacey, you may take the stand. But be advised, you are under oath, and any false or misleading testimony will be subject to federal review. Daniel nodded once. Understood, Your Honor. As he made his way to the witness stand, the air in the courtroom became impossibly still. Even the court reporter had stopped typing momentarily, eyes fixed on the tall man adjusting the microphone. Felton stood. State your name and occupation for the record. Daniel Marcus Lacey. Supervisory Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And your relationship to the defendant? He's my father. Felton took a breath. You mentioned an earlier incident involving Officer Lawson. Please explain. Daniel looked directly at the jury box. 6 years ago, my father was walking home from the pharmacy. He had recently undergone heart surgery and was moving slow. Officer Lawson pulled up beside him, claimed he matched a vague description of someone who had stolen cigarettes nearby. The room was silent. My father calmly explained who he was and what he'd just picked up from the store. Despite that, Officer Lawson ordered him to the ground. He refused. He was afraid the movement would tear his incision. Daniel's voice hardened slightly. So Lawson threw him down. Ripped his shirt. Cracked his ribs. My father was hospitalized for 4 days. The defense attorney for Lawson stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. There is no formal record of this incident. It's unsubstantiated. Daniel didn't flinch. That's because my father begged me not to file it. He said, and I quote, "Let it go, son. I've lived through worse." The judge turned to the defense. You're free to cross-examine. But I'm allowing it. Felton looked back at Daniel. Why are you speaking up now? Daniel glanced at his father. Because he won't protect Lawson anymore. And neither will I. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Patrolman Lawson looked visibly shaken now. His hands gripped the edges of the table. Sweat beaded near his hairline. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but Lawson didn't respond. Felton approached the bench once more. Your Honor, in light of this testimony and the new evidence admitted into the record, the defense respectfully moves to have the charges against Mr. Howard Lacey dismissed. Judge Harmon glanced over his glasses. I assume the prosecution has an objection. The district attorney, who until now had treated the case as routine, slowly stood. He hesitated. Your Honor, given the totality of what's been presented, including potential misconduct by the arresting officer, the state will not oppose the motion. The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs. Howard blinked as if he hadn't heard right. Felton gently placed a hand on his shoulder. That means it's over, Mr. Lacey. You're free to go. The judge raised his gavel. All charges against Howard Lacey are hereby dismissed. Officer Lawson, remain seated. This court is issuing a formal recommendation for internal investigation by the State Department of Public Safety. Bang! The gavel came down. It was done. Howard slowly stood, his knees trembling. Daniel moved toward him immediately and caught him with a steady arm. Their eyes met, father and son, no words spoken, just the weight of years between them finally released. Officer Lawson, still seated, watched them. His expression was unreadable now. Not anger. Not fear. Just realization. As the courtroom slowly emptied, reporters swarmed near the exit, whispering about what had just unfolded, how a simple misdemeanor case had cracked open a deeper truth no one saw coming. But Howard Lacey and his son didn't stop for cameras. They walked through the courthouse hallway side by side, Daniel's hand still resting lightly on his father's back. At one point, Howard slowed down, pausing near a courthouse bench. I didn't want this, he said quietly. All I ever wanted was to be treated like a man. That's it. Daniel looked down at him, the corners of his eyes tight. You are a man, Dad. You always were. That's why I had to step in. Howard gave a small, tired nod. Across the hall, Officer Lawson was escorted into a private conference room by two men in plain clothes, state investigators. The door shut behind them with a dull click. His badge, once gleaming on his chest, had already been removed. Daniel turned to his father. They'll do a full review now. Not just this incident, everything. Howard gave a faint, knowing smile. Took long enough. Outside the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. Journalists called out questions. Agent Lacey, will there be a federal inquiry? Is your father planning to sue? Was this all a setup? Daniel didn't flinch. He stepped forward, stood still for a moment, then spoke clearly and calmly. My father didn't ask for this. He didn't seek revenge. He believed in the system, even when it failed him. Today, it didn't. And that's the story. Then he turned back to Howard. Let's go home. The drive home was quiet. Howard stared out the passenger side window, watching trees blur past. His old neighborhood hadn't changed much, same cracked sidewalks, same rusted mailbox at the corner, same neighbors sitting on porches pretending not to watch. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel put the car in park but didn't move. You sure you're okay staying here for a while? He asked. Howard nodded. This house has been my whole life. I don't want it to end being afraid of my own street. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then I'll have agents check in on you. Regularly. Howard smiled weakly. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, Daniel said. But I will. They stepped inside the house, greeted by the smell of old wood and worn leather chairs. Howard settled into his recliner like it was a throne he hadn't sat in for weeks. Daniel stood quietly, looking around. His childhood photos still lined the mantel, his mother's old quilt still draped over the couch. Everything was normal. But something had changed. Howard picked up the TV remote but didn't turn it on. Instead, he looked at his son. You didn't just protect me today, Daniel, he said softly. You reminded me that staying silent isn't the same as staying strong. Daniel nodded. And you reminded me why I joined the bureau in the first place. Outside, the sun was starting to set, casting long gold lines through the living room window. For the first time in a long time, Howard exhaled, not the breath of fear or survival, but relief. The following morning, the story had gone national. News outlets across the country ran variations of the same headline: Senior Citizen Assault Case Dropped After FBI's Son Exposes Officer's Troubling Past. Clips of Daniel's courtroom testimony were already circulating online. Social media was ablaze with commentary, praise, and calls for broader investigations into similar incidents across the state. Inside his modest home, Howard sat in his kitchen, slowly stirring a cup of coffee. The television played quietly in the background, but he wasn't watching. His attention was on the envelope in his hands, one Daniel had left for him before heading back to D.C. He opened it. Inside was a letter. Dad, you always told me justice isn't loud. That it's patient. That it comes when you stand up, even if your voice shakes. Yesterday, the system heard you. But I want you to know, whether it had or not, I would have stood beside you anyway. We're not done yet. There are others like you. I plan to make sure their voices get heard, too. Love, Daniel. Howard folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his coffee. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He stood up, walked to the window, and opened the curtain wide. Outside, neighbors waved. Not awkwardly. Not pitying. Just respect. He raised his hand in return. Later that week, a formal investigation into Officer Brett Lawson was announced by the state's Department of Public Safety. The internal memo leaked almost immediately. It confirmed that Lawson's conduct over the past decade would be reviewed, including the use of force incidents Daniel had uncovered, and several more that came to light after the courtroom exposure prompted new whistleblower tips. At the FBI's regional office, Daniel sat in a glass-walled conference room reviewing documents. His supervisor walked in, holding a folder. You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, the man said, setting the file down. Daniel didn't look up. Good. It needed stirring. His supervisor nodded slowly. Internal Affairs wants to know if you plan to pursue this pattern further, state by state. You've already got traction with 2 more jurisdictions. Daniel finally looked up. If you're asking if I'm backing off, no. I've seen what silence does. It's not an option anymore. The supervisor studied him for a moment, then cracked a faint smile. Didn't think so. You've got full clearance to proceed. Keep it clean, Lacey. Back in his father's neighborhood, something subtle had changed, too. Local officers now patrolled more respectfully. Neighbors who once ignored Howard now stopped to talk. A councilwoman even paid him a visit to hear concerns from longtime residents. Howard wasn't seeking attention. But people were finally listening. At the center of it all, the quiet dignity of a man who had endured and never lost his sense of who he was, and the son who reminded everyone what real accountability looks like. 2 months later, the state announced formal disciplinary action against Officer Lawson. He was suspended indefinitely without pay, pending the outcome of multiple investigations. The department issued a rare public statement acknowledging a failure of internal oversight and promised institutional reforms. Meanwhile, Howard had become something of a reluctant symbol, though he never asked for that role. He declined interviews, politely turned down invitations to speak, and instead focused on his garden, his books, and the peace that had long eluded him. But one afternoon, he did agree to speak, once. It was at the local community center, during a forum on law enforcement accountability. The room was packed. Daniel stood in the back, arms crossed, listening quietly. Howard stepped up to the podium with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had earned the right to take his time. "I'm not here to point fingers," he began. "I'm here because silence cost me too much already. And if telling the truth now helps someone else be treated with decency tomorrow, then I figure that's worth the discomfort." He paused. "I don't hate anyone. I just want people to do right. Especially the ones who wear a badge." There was a long, thoughtful silence before the applause started, not loud or explosive, but steady. Respectful. Real. Later that night, as they left together, Daniel turned to him and said, "You didn't just speak for yourself in there." Howard looked up at him and replied, "I wasn't the only one who needed to be heard." Spring came early that year. Howard's neighborhood bloomed brighter than usual, flower beds freshly planted, sidewalks cleaned by local volunteers, and a new bench installed on the corner with a small engraved plaque, in honor of those who speak when it's hardest. Howard never asked for it. In fact, he tried to protest. But the community insisted. They had seen something shift after his story broke, not just in the courtroom, but in how people treated each other. With more caution. More humility. More humanity. Daniel visited every other weekend when his bureau schedule allowed. The visits weren't about justice anymore. They were just father and son catching up, watching games, fixing a leaky faucet, or arguing about which coffee brand was better. One evening, as they sat on the porch listening to cicadas hum in the dusk, Howard spoke without looking up. "You did good, son." Daniel smiled. "So did you." Howard nodded slowly. "Guess we both remembered what matters." They sat there in silence, letting the weight of the past settle behind them, acknowledged, but no longer pressing on their backs. In the end, Howard didn't need revenge. He just needed truth. And with his son beside him, the truth had stood tall.